Ready?
Ready.
3, 2, 1.
This is The Jungle, an up-close, unvarnished look inside leadership and business strategy. We wade into the real-world leaders' face and explore what they do to create a path forward, because that's what business is. Wild, exciting.
It's The Jungle.
Derek, welcome to The Jungle, buddy.
Good to be back, Doug. Good to be back. Exciting.
What are you watching now that we can't go outside because it's snowing? The kids are home. You're exhausted at the end of the day. What are you watching on TV?
Got to be honest, I watch finance news, CNBC more than anything, and some other news just to figure out what's going on. How about you? What are you watching?
Well, we started watching Tiger King. It's good. It's good television. I'd recommend it. Everybody's watching it. It's a little bit lighthearted at the end of the day, which you kind of need. You're kind of kicking back. You put a fire in the fireplace because it's snowing outside in April. You turn on Tiger King. It gives you a little laugh. It's good times. I enjoy it. Yeah. So let's dive into this intro here. So we had the great pleasure of having Kevin Carmody on the podcast and had a great conversation with him. Kevin has an amazing resume and a great position. So Kevin Carmody is the leader of the organizational transformational practice at McKinsey. He's a senior partner there, and he really specializes on corporate restructuring, has a lot of insight around resilience, thinks a lot about how a CFO might think about resiliency and organizational turnaround. So a real attention to that. He's served across lots of different industries in different sectors, different geographies. He has an MBA from Kellogg, undergrad from the great Western Michigan University. A phenomenal guy, has mentored our students this semester on a consulting project with us. Just a tremendous, tremendous guy, really responsive, and had some great insights for us. So what were your takeaways from the conversation, Derek?
Yeah, so I'll second that. Tremendous guy. Wow. And does he travel? Holy, that's a travel schedule. Is that not, Doug?
That is a travel schedule.
That's the old days. I couldn't do that anymore, I don't think, but good for him. So I had some critical takeaways. One, uncertainty is tough right now. Everyone's trying to plan and managing uncertainty and making decisions in uncertain times when it's day by day, hour by hour. He really highlighted that there's a lot of uncertainty out there and no one kind of knows, and trying to manage companies in that is tough. And then my next 2 points, what I really liked from him were the follow-on to that. He said downside forecasting, make the worst possible forecast case, build that forecast model, and it actually frees up your decision-making. I was amazed to listen to that. Make the downside, see what the downside is. Actually, it's freeing for decision makers because it allows you to start moving forward and actually making decisions. I thought that was a really good point. And then I'll keep going on that. I like finance, Doug. Keep going on that path. Forecasting and is not just a finance focus. The whole organization has to be involved with these forecasting decisions. It's not Excel. It's understanding how these decisions impact the factory floors and the manufacturing and what that means for the products you produce and the services. Just amazing insights there. What'd you have, Doug? What did you take from him as a good Bronco?
Yeah, the downside, forecasting the downside to free decision making was a tremendous one, and that's a great lead into one of my points, which was the call for greater, faster decision making, and really that your point really helps facilitate the speed and seeing even in his experience with a lot of his clients the speed needing to continue to be there. The other point that I really liked was he talked about what is the meeting cadence he likes to see from these senior leadership teams to make sure that they're really operational. That's a 30-minute meeting every day, standing meeting, looking at the business, looking at issues around liquidity, and making that a standardized thing. The third point that I had was there's no lonelier place right now than being a CEO. And you think about the responsibility that these leaders have, the uncertainty that they're facing. It's a humbling experience. Doesn't matter what your background in, as no one has seen this before. So I thought that's another thing to keep in mind. And that's one reason why we're doing the podcast, right? Is to highlight and go behind the scenes to really get an exposure around that, to know that there are other people in that situation. So great conversation that we had.
Yep. And here's the podcast with Kevin.
The Jungle is produced by the Center for Principled Leadership and Business Strategy in Western Michigan University's Hayworth College of Business. Our center supports the Leadership and Business Strategy major, conducts large-scale consulting projects, and trains professionals in acquiring and operating small businesses. To learn more, visit wmich.edu/leadership center.
Are you a golfer? A big golfer? The Masters flag?
I was back before the world ended. I was a huge golfer. Yeah. I was supposed to be there today, actually.
Let's. Do you have a beverage here, Kevin?
I got one right here, man. Yeah.
Let's have a cheers here. Welcome, Kevin Carmody, to the podcast.
Great to be here.
So tell us a little bit about that flag. What year was that? When did you get that?
That was 2006. That's actually before I went down there. So first time I went to Augusta was 2012, but I went 13, 15, and 16, but I haven't been back in 4 years.
2006, was this a Tiger year?
That was a Tiger year, right? Because Phil would have been 2004. I think that's right. Maybe that's actually, I don't know. It's either Phil or Tiger, one of the two.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't seem right when I got a little bit of flowers on the trees out here. We don't get to see the magnolias going right now, right? This would be Masters weekend. It's Masters weekend. We would have had the NCAA Final Four earlier this week. My birthday's on Sunday. It would have been the most epic week we had here, you know?
I think that's right. And Jim Nance just talked about how he's hanging out at his house in Pebble Beach, where he normally would go from the Final Four to Masters. So he's home unexpectedly.
Yeah.
Hopefully this will pass quickly.
So do you have you had any new exciting routines now, Kevin, now that you are quarantined at home that you're doing?
So I was telling somebody earlier that because I've traveled my entire career, I've had something in the ballpark of 25 consecutive family dinners, which is not a bad thing. That's a silver lining in a world where I'm on a plane every week. So I'm here a lot more, which is great for me. My wife and kids might have a different view, but I've been home more. That's good.
Yeah. So what is that like now, being home, given the travel usually every week? Now you're home. How are you adjusting to that?
I mean, I think it's, that's been the good thing, because you're around. I see a lot more. I mean, I've been able to manage my travel the older I've gotten, but it's, this is what a normal lifestyle looks like. I think the amount I travel is actually dysfunctional. That's one thing I've learned.
Yeah.
So that's the good thing. And the bad news is I actually enjoy, I think working with people face-to-face, the clients that I have, and seeing them. We're doing a lot of stuff on Zoom, but I think that interpersonal communication actually makes a huge difference. And that's one of the revelations that I came up with, for sure.
Yeah. Well, Kevin's a Bronco, and is graciously and amazingly helping to mentor our students on a project this semester in LBS, which we know we're super appreciative of. And we get great stories from our students about you and different lessons, little things that you've shared with them along the way during that experience. Do you have a great Bronco memory? Do you have a great Western memory of your time here in Kalamazoo that you wanted to share?
I would say, there's a lot. I used to go to Lake Michigan on the weekends down at South Haven. That was fantastic. But I would say, looking back on it, some of the best times I had, the most exciting times I had, was when I sat in section 17 of Lawson. You'll like this, Derek. Watching the Broncos hockey team play. That was at a time where, it was great. The games against Michigan State and Michigan coming in to play Western Michigan was a ton of fun. And we had a pretty good team back then. So I would say, looking back on that, I do miss Friday and Saturday nights at Lawson.
Awesome. Yeah. Awesome atmosphere at Lawson. I got to give the fans and the Lawson Lunatics some credit on that one. That's a really good building to play in. But very cool.
So thanks, Kevin, for taking 30 minutes out of your, I imagine, just totally chaos. Is it just chaos on your end right now?
Yeah, I think it's, the last 30 days, there are 375 days in the month of March, is how I like to explain it. It's a mark in the history. But we do, the companies, what companies have been able to do over the last 30 days has been pretty amazing, because I think everybody was so caught off guard. No surprise. So just operating in a crisis mode where you've got a $21 trillion economy that shuts down is like nothing any of us could ever expect. But what I've seen is, these management teams are moving so quickly to understand how to compete and preserve their business. And there's a lot, this probably doesn't get a lot of play, but the amount of time these executives I'm talking to, at least, are thinking about how do I preserve this company? How do I save jobs? It's a really, really tough time to sort through. But over 30 days, they've actually, I think, made the shift from how do you manage in a crisis situation, how do you manage cash, into thinking about, hey, at some point, demand's going to recover. And they're starting to think about, let's be forward leaning. Let's think about how we want to compete when we come out of this downturn, which in over 30 days, that shift has been incredible. You had just a fully functioning economy, 29,000 on the Dow. Then you go into absolute chaos. And now they're stabilizing the business and coming out of it. That's all in 30 days. So it's absolutely incredible. The resilience, I think, has been amazing. It's been very tough, but I mean, the resilience of people has been amazing.
So that's really, I think, informational for most of the people that listen to this. Step back for a second, then we'll get super tactical. How about that? Step back and how is this crisis the same, different? What's unique? What are the major challenges in regards to this pandemic with all the uncertainty, all the changes, and the rapidness with how this showed up for all these companies?
So I think people's memories are a little bit short. So and even mine, I went back and looked at what happened in 08. And you think about how much the stock market dropped. I would have guessed the stock market dropped 35% during the global financial crisis. Then you start looking, I think it was a peak like 55%, 60%, something drastic. So people forget that on how bad it was and it recovered. So I think there's a certain amount of that here. The difference in this crisis, people first said it was a health crisis, but it's a health and economic crisis. I think the problem here is there's no real end in sight right now. People want to understand, when are we going to be able to go outside? Is that April? Is that May? Is that September? Does the virus subside and come back? So I think that level of uncertainty and what that means to the economy is unlike any other prior recession that we've seen. But there are similarities, and I'm advising my clients on this. I do think, as we've gone back in time and taken a look at how companies have reacted to shocks, whether it be 08, whether it be 01, even going back to World War II, we do see just data. We do see that the level of forecasting on how bad it could get, folks have missed that more often than not. So we're trying to say, how do you get a grasp on just how bad this can get, the impact of liquidity, and how does that inform your decision-making as an executive team? Being a little more bearish to basically set the downside boundary is something that I think those mistakes have been made in every recession and are being made here as well, because but I'll go back to my initial point, Derek. I just think the uncertainty without a clear path forward is probably the most troubling.
So that made me a little bit nervous. So from your guys' interpretation, how you're advising clients, you're saying it could be more bearish than what we're actually thinking right now, and that the downside could be much lower. I know not to predict markets, the uncertainty, but in the past
I think it's Dr. Fauci said it right. Like he wants to overcorrect to set that downside boundary. So what I'm saying is, I would bias to having, you've got your base case, but I would do a scenario that says it's going to be deeper and longer, and see what that does to your performance. See what that does to liquidity. So you at least understand what that underlying boundary is and hope that it never gets there. I'd rather have that than a situation where you underestimate how bad it can get, and all of a sudden you've got a problem on your hands because you might default on your credit facilities, or you might not have enough liquidity, something like that. So I think it's a strategic planning around how do I manage in different environments and how that informs decision-making over the near to medium term. I think that's really important. And by the way, the other side too, and to be positive, I mean, there are companies in this economy that have seen a spike in demand. So think of consumer companies that products continue to fly off the shelves. We've seen that too. And they've said, great, now that I have the lower boundary of how bad it can get, I can actually spend time thinking, does it make sense to go on the offensive? And I go on the offensive, how am I thinking about buying assets? How am I thinking about competing when demand recovers? And that will position them to be even more effective when demand will return. And it will return. My question is uncertainty in the timing of that, but it will return. So I think the management teams that get a handle on the downside case, it actually frees them up to begin thinking about how they want to run the business, not just in the next week, but over the next 12 to 18 months. And I think that's important.
So Kevin, you've got a unique position and point of view to be able to see these companies and these senior leadership teams walk through this. And you talked a lot about speed. What are the really tactical lessons that you would want to share with folks about what is helping these senior teams be more or less effective and how they're responding?
I think recognizing that we live in great uncertainty and the variables that impact the business, the key drivers they change anytime, but they're changing rapidly today, hour by hour, day by day. That's just the world we live in. So I think understanding that's where we are is important, but I also think that not just cash, I'm talking about cash today a lot, but cash can't just be a finance focus. So I think there's a lot of benefit in executive teams that focus on not only finance, but what happens in a production facility, what happens in your supply chain, how are you dealing with customers from a commercial perspective, and getting those different points of view all anchored around how you manage in the short term to protect the business, but how you think about running over the next 12 to 18 months is important. And making sure those views are heard in one instance, but also making sure that people are moving quickly. Because I think decisions have to be made with imperfect information, and they've got to be made faster. So where we see feedback we've gotten in pockets is that management teams are having trouble getting their head around that. So they're a little bit frozen at times. And that's okay, that's natural. But I think having an understanding of what your degrees of freedom are and how you react to this environment is important. It's important to have the right messaging out there. It's important to make the right decisions. And it's just not operating in the ordinary course. I mean, we're in a bit of a, well, we'll see. Because demand has fallen off the cliff in the short term, it takes a different muscle to manage through the short term. But I think that, and balancing with the fact that you're going to be back in business at some point, so the decisions you make today will impact how viable you are coming out of this downturn. Having that right perspective, I think, is important.
So when you think about making those quick decisions with speed, with incomplete information in a situation that no one knows, I mean, what makes one way that you see better at executing against that and doing that? Because that can freeze a lot of people. What explains the success there, like really tactically?
I think I think having the right balance between being thoughtful and analytical, which is really important. What's the fact-based data that you're going to use to make those decisions, and it will be imperfect. But also pivoting to the point where you actually make a call is important. What can happen, I think, very easily we could get spun around the analytical rigor around a problem, and it's an intellectual exercise where you actually don't make the decision. It's tough to make that pivot because there's a lot at stake. But I think, again, it goes back to that balance. I mean, you have to make progress. And even simple things like making sure that you're communicating to the broader organization around what's happening and how you're reacting to this environment. And that transparency with employees from the C-suite all the way down to I'll say the third shift supervisor in a plant is important. Because people want to understand that you're honest, you're transparent, and that you're dealing with a very difficult situation, but you're doing everything you can to protect the company and actually prepare for a point in time where we're going to get back to some sense of normalcy. I think that's very easy. It's an aspirational target, very easy to say. It's very difficult to execute when you're in the moment.
Yeah. Now, would you, let's zoom out from some of those tactical things. And, there's debates out there that you hear, the world's going to be fundamentally different. Higher education, totally disrupted. There's not a normal we're going back to. It's a new way, right? And there's others that, this is a blip, we return. And that probably varies across a lot of different things. How are you thinking about this being a shock that fundamentally changes or not the industries that you're working with?
I mean, it's a tough question to answer, but I don't know. I'm not a physician, but I would think, once we have clarity on testing, once we have clarity on treatment, that's going to dictate what the next normal looks like, frankly. So who knows? I don't think we go back to the way it was in February of 2020. I also we'll have to see. It's going to play out over time. This can shift so quickly. I mean, you look at just even the forecasts that are coming through in the States on what COVID is doing changes so dramatically that I think you just have to, I try to simplify the playbook. I just think you have to maintain that balance, right? You've got to get through it. I think in terms of 30 to 60 days, but I'm also thinking about in some of my clients, what's the opportunity on the backside, right?
So some of your clients, let's poke at that one. Opportunity in the backside. Are you seeing any adversity challenges to solve? People start thinking different ways. The processes change, the procedures change. Are you seeing any clients start to think about innovations, changes to their business model, changes to how they'll serve customers differently in the future, adding new services, procedures to what they already have, products even? Are you seeing any of that yet, or are we still in the hey, let's make sure we got liquidity first, worry about that, and then we're not quite there yet? What stage are we in?
So for the company, I'll use the example of the companies that are actually seeing an increase in demand because of what the industry they service. I mean, you've got on one end, you've got retailers, and you've got travel companies like airlines. They're in a tough spot for obvious reasons, but there are other ones that are like consumer, for example, where you see pockets of uptick in demand. I still think that having real clarity around your liquidity position over the next 12 to 18 months and solving for how bad that can get or what a base case might look like gives freedom to these management teams. And what I've also seen is that once they band what that liquidity profile looks like, and frankly, mitigation strategies to ensure they don't run out of liquidity, then all of a sudden for these companies, they're starting to think about how they go on the offensive. So it could be end products. Let's say there's a company that has 3 specific segments and one is not going to return. How do you think about still servicing that segment that's going to be underperforming? But what pivot do you need to make across the rest of your customer base and just stratifying it accordingly as one? So that's strategic in nature. And the second thing too is there's even discussions around talent acquisition. So in a world where we wanted to do something as an executive team, and maybe it's to your point, maybe it's innovation and complexity. We wanted to bring somebody on board that would think about the next generation of products, and we don't have that in-house today. That because of the disruption, that there's opportunities to bring folks on board to tackle those types of issues. And by the way, when you talk about innovation and product complexity, what that basically means is it's a vehicle for growth. So how are management teams thinking less about liquidity now that they've actually understood what the range of possibilities are, and moving into that innovation topic is pretty important. There's a guy in the marketplace that I think can help us and try to figure out what needs to happen to bring somebody like that on board. That's a really positive development. So it's a way to take the mindset from being overwhelmed in a crisis situation into managing that risk, but also thinking about the fact that you will run the business hopefully sooner than we might think, and what are the changes you need to make to optimize the enterprise value of that company. So
when let's take a couple of those themes. So you're dealing with the short-term, medium-term liquidity challenges, plus the strategic innovation kind of ideas. When you think about a meeting cadence or a structure, or how is this unfolding in these senior management teams that help balance all that stuff? What are you seeing from a tactical level?
There's a lot of different things happening. So we'd say if you just focus on liquidity, what I've said is it can't be finance. It can be finance-led, but not entirely finance-driven. So there's a lot of value in getting, I think, executives together once a day for 30 minutes, but put a time box on it. What happened today on liquidity? What major changes with our customer and vendor base have we seen since last night? What things are on the short-term horizon? Just to anchor on the daily management of the business, I think provides a good perspective, and at some level gives comfort to management teams that they're thinking about the right variables. So that's one. I do think kind of easing some of the anxiety that we just can't control is important, so that you free up the decision making of these executive teams. I would say, as an extreme position, we don't want 10 members of an executive team all focusing on one decision when 15 decisions have to be made. So there's something around how do you organize that and adjust your operating model, because we're firefighting right now, so that we actually make the decisions of the team that are necessary to drive the business today and also as we go into the future. So there's a slight adjustment, because in human nature could be in a world where you've got imperfect information, the variables are changing. You can see folks huddling around one specific decision and maybe spending 3 hours to make that decision, but not addressing the other 14 that have to be made today. So there's something around being clear around what is the objective of the business and what do we really have to focus on in a world where we're all constrained, right? How do you delegate that authority, if you will?
So it's a 30-minute meeting, all hands senior leadership team kind of reviewing the state of the state, and then would you advise these senior leadership teams to kind of break off into the separate work streams that they have to execute against to do these decisions, and then they regroup, later in the day, or how does that on a day-to-day basis?
I think there's a lot of different views, but I think that 30-minute meeting brings the leaders together so they can all rally around what is important, what needs to happen today, and then they disperse into their different pockets of the company. I think that's exactly right. What you're ultimately trying to do is you're trying to be as efficient as possible, use the information that's available, and understand what it is that you need to decide today. But the real world example is how many times have you seen a finance organization that pulls together the results of the business. And it's backward looking because it's GAAP accounting, right? So this is what happened last month. And you go on the shop floor and the shop floor says, I feel good about our financial reporting, but I'm thinking about, I need forward looking metrics. And what I'm getting out of finance doesn't really address what I need to see to forecast the slowness in the business. That's even before COVID. That's a real issue. What we're saying is there's a way to bring these functions together so that the finance team, who has usually the best access to information, can understand what the production supervisor on a shop floor needs to run his business. Important in ordinary times, even more so today. So those two are linking together, right? And that doesn't become, well, finance does the financials and runs cash, and I run the plant. What we're trying to do is integrate those two so they leverage their strengths and they get to a better outcome. So there's part of it's the cash, the meeting each for 30 minutes brings everybody together, but they go out into different aspects of the company. But everybody should be on the same page because we're all trying to measure performance. We're all trying to figure out how to react to a constantly changing environment. And hopefully the way that we work together is different, and the information that we're using might be different too, so that we can predict changes in the business.
You know, a lot of the smaller, medium-sized companies that we often do consulting for or work with don't have access to dashboards. They don't have access to some of this real-time data, and so they're really flying blind through this thing. Do you have advice for them who don't have those systems in place of how they're muddling their way through?
Well, I'd say I talked about this earlier today. In different IT systems, different companies, there's always going to be information constraints. But I would say, especially for an executive team, figure out those data points that are the most important. So the example that I've used recently is a lot of companies are P&L focused. So it's about the income statement, and maybe you say, hey, we're focusing on EBITDA, right? Or adjusted EBITDA. That's important. But I think liquidity, if it's not your top KPI, it should be pretty close. So I think it's making sure that you understand the metrics that you need to run the business and putting it in a dashboard. So an example might be, I would want to see as a CFO each day, what is my liquidity position today? What's the unrestricted cash on hand? What's my availability under my existing credit facilities? What's that number? And I'd also want to understand how my scenarios have changed based on new information. So updating the short-term model, important. Again, to identify where my low point in liquidity is. And frankly, I'd also want to understand, are there customers that are at risk because they can't make payments any longer? What is the impact to my business when that happens? And what I do to help them out? Same thing on the vendor side. If I'm running a plant, but I'm worried about a key input or a key ingredient that doesn't enter my plant, and therefore I don't have what I need to make my product, and I can't fulfill customer orders, I want to know that sooner than later. So there's something around escalating those types of, I'll call them big rocks, to the executive suite so they have the right information that could materially disrupt the business today. But it shouldn't be a 15 or 20 page dashboard. I'm thinking, are there 2 to 3 pages graphically oriented that give me the information I know so I can look at it and say, okay, now I've got my thumb on the pulse, and it informs my decision-making as I go through the remainder of the day.
Let's talk maybe a little bit about leadership in the kind of the pure sense, in the motivational, inspirational influence kind of capacity. What are you seeing as some examples of great leadership? What are the behaviors, the traits that you're seeing in this crisis? You're like, wow, this is top-notch leadership through a crisis.
Yeah, I'd say, heroes are made in times like these. So there's been a ton of these inspirational stories. I don't know that executive teams get enough credit for how they're thinking about protecting the company and protecting their employee base. These are all very difficult decisions that they're making. But I think the leadership around pivoting very quickly, being respectful of people, worrying about people's safety and health, and making sure that they communicate in a very transparent fashion, even in a world where that wasn't the biggest strength for some folks, but changing the way they think about it in this environment. I see those stories every day. I mean, these people, there's a lot of weight on these people's shoulders as they think about how they continue to operate. And I think that story should be told because it's inspirational. I mean, I don't know that there's a lonelier place on the planet right now than being a CEO or a CFO in an environment like this because of the uncertainty, right? Even in a recession, you might be able to forecast when that ends, but you've got an economy that came to a standstill, and how do you operate in that environment? There's a lot of, I think the burden placed on these people's shoulders is very difficult. That's obvious, but the behavior, at least what I've seen, in the subset of clients that I talk to, I think is pretty inspirational. These guys are working around the clock to try to get their head around the situation. I'm impressed with the questions that are being asked and how they're trying to get information and apply it to their business. If there's a silver lining, it's that human story I think is real.
Someone said to me, one of my neighbors said, the whole experience is humbling, because human beings think we have so much control over the world. And then you get something like this, and it just really makes you step back and really kind of put you in your place of how difficult this whole thing is. Being a leader of that is another level, because you have all those people that you're responsible for. Do you have one more question, Derek, before we kind of go for rapid fire?
Yeah, I guess I'm still thinking about the downside. Make it further down than you think. What are your biggest fears for some of these companies? Obviously, some of them are probably going to go bankrupt. That's likely to happen. I'm assuming it depends on how long this goes. Depends on some of the liquidity they get from their lenders and some of the leniency they get. But what are your biggest fears that you see right now? That you're facing, or some of your companies are facing, and then what's got you really scared right now, if anything?
Yeah, I don't know. I think you've got some sectors out there that are struggling. You think about, this is obvious, but you think about retailers today that have shut their doors for a period of time. When do they open back up, and how do they have the merchandise on their shelves to serve their customers? And what will customers do? What does the balance sheet of the consumer spend? Consumers look like in a world where that spend is 70% of our GDP? I think that's an unknown, right? The longer that we stay in that, I think that's troubling. I do think that comes as one man's view, but I think that does come back at some level, right? But I think there's a question around how do retailers, how do airlines, how do restaurants survive through that? That's a real concern. So I just think we're gonna have to see how that plays out. I do think, though, at the end of the day, it's hard to see past the current crisis. But if you look at history, even in some of the most drastic shocks, we're resilient as a society. So I do think you'll see that once we have a light at the end of the tunnel. I think you'll see that resiliency. There's going to be some pent up demand too. If people want to get outdoors, right? And people want to go golfing. People want to go to restaurants. The question is, when will that occur?
I want to go outside, but I got to be honest with you, Kevin. I just saw snow come down. Not kidding.
That's brutal.
That's April 9th in Michigan. So we want to conclude with some rapid fire questions. These are 1 word, 2 word kind of answers. Have you seen Inside the Actor Studio? This is
yeah.
Yep. Okay. So similar format. So we got about 5 or 6 of these. Are you ready?
Fire away.
Okay. Favorite leader?
Reagan.
Courage or compassion?
Courage.
Speed or accuracy?
Speed.
Liking or respect?
Respect.
Great ideas or great execution?
Great execution.
A word to describe your leadership style?
Collaborative.
And if you had to have a spirit animal really symbolize your leadership style, what's your spirit animal?
Tiger, but not influenced by the recent miniseries. Let me just be clear on
that. that is the talk of the students and the talk of the town these days. So,
and the president yesterday. So talk of everybody.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Kevin Carmody, for joining us on the podcast.
Great to be here, guys. Thanks for everything you're doing.